New Zealand students take out huge loans to pay for fees to go to university. It's not like that in Scotland, is it?
It's not like that at all. Not only New Zealand students take out huge loans. In the United States now, debt on education is larger than credit card debt, which is a fact that always scares the life out of me. Now, we have a tradition of free education. We think it underpins who we are as a learning nation. We're the country that's had the longest tradition of compulsory schooling in the world. We have the oldest teaching union in the world, the oldest registration body for teachers. So we have a fairly clear idea of what we should be doing, and one of those things is providing free education at every level.
Why do you do that?
Because education is not just an individual good, it's a societal good. It's an investment in society, particularly if you're a small country. What you're investing in is what's going to happen in the next generation. If you look at one of the statistics about Scottish university education, about 3/4, perhaps slightly more than 3/4 of young people in Scotland who go to university stay in Scotland and work in Scotland. Now that means that what you're doing is you're putting the money into their education and you're getting it out in their contribution to the economy. That doesn't mean those who go away do less well, they sometimes come back, but it's about investing in the future of society. And we've taken a very conscious decision that that's what education is about.
I'm delighted to hear you say that, because that's the opposite to what is happening in New Zealand. I got a free education when I came here, and I've stayed. My son had to pay for his education, and he's gone. He's gone to France, and he's working there. So I do wonder whether, is it your experience that in fact by giving a free education you're buying loyalty to your homeland?
It could be, and I heard a Singapore minister talking about this as an exercise in nation building. What education does is build a nation. And of course Scotland is a nation that is in the process of building its future, so it's an important thing. But it's a part of also your sense of yourself. Scotland sees itself as a learning nation. We have 5 of the world's top 200 universities in Scotland. That's remarkable for a nation of 5 million people. There must be a reason for it. And the reason is centuries of educational activity and practice. The oldest of those universities go back to the 16th century. And a belief that education is how you carry society on. It's in our DNA, it's in our culture, it's in our economy, and it's part of who. But it's not a universally popular view. You know, we are the neighbour to a larger country which has the highest university fees in Europe, and that produces difficulties and tensions.
I read that almost 50% of students study science at a higher level. That's extraordinary.
Well, it isn't quite as good as that. The statistics are very broad, but we are trying to intensify and continue to intensify what we call the STEM subjects. There are some difficulties in that. Not enough girls and women study the sciences. Engineering is not as attractive as it should be. We actually think we're not doing nearly well enough. We also don't think we're doing well enough in languages. And I've invested in a policy which will, in schools, give every child the opportunity to learn their own language and 2 others. And that will help as well. So we think there are problems in our system, things we have to do. And the policy of having free higher education has also been one we've had to fight for. It's not presently universally accepted across the Scottish Parliament.
We're seeing the introduction of charter schools into New Zealand. Our present government would prefer to call them public-private partnerships. Mm-hmm. Do you do that in Scotland?
No, we don't. We have a comprehensive educational system. We have a collaborative system, and it's a distributed system. And what that means is leadership in Scottish education, delivery of Scottish education has devolved to the local authorities. That's the tradition we've had. That is essentially allows a variation in curriculum, and we have some tremendously good practice. But there isn't a place for being more diverse than that, largely because of geography. Something like 80% of Scottish children go to their local school. If you set up different schools, they compete with those schools, and one school that succeeds, another school that fails. Your job is to make every school a really good school. Not to say we've given up on those ones, right? We'll do it somewhere else. So our work is to try and close the equity gap. Now, we've had a wider gap than we should have, and we're working on closing that gap. But we don't believe that comes from simple diversity in delivery mechanisms. It comes from supporting the system and making sure the system becomes better.
You've just spoken about collaboration. Our experience of making every school autonomous and also taking great notice of PISA results and posting results about how schools are performing is that we're seeing a lot of competition in our education system. Competition or cooperation? What's the best way forward?
We have collaboration rather than competition between schools. There is a worldwide dichotomy. It's an issue in the world. It's called GERM, Global Education Reform Movement. And the Finns have been particularly strong, and a Finnish educator called Pasi Salberg has written extensively on it. Scotland is very, very clearly identified in the Finnish model. We're not in the GERM model. We're not into a monetarisation of the system or a system that's driven by that type of competition. That's not to say we're not into parental involvement, parental choice, but if you're going to understand a school, you've got to understand the performance of that school in terms of its socioeconomic context, in terms of how it is progressing, in terms of wider achievement as well as attainment. So you need a more rounded view. We don't publish league tables per se because they give you a very narrow view, in our view. What we do is we publish information on that school, a great deal of information on that school. We help parents to understand that information and understand the education system that exists. One of the problems, again worldwide, every education minister has it, is that everybody's been to school. So everybody's an expert on how schooling should be done. When you're going to change a system, you've got to spend time helping parents to understand why some of the things that they experience aren't the right things for the 21st century. Our curriculum for excellence, the way in which we're now delivering education in Scotland, isn't so focused on examination. It certainly isn't so focused on inspection. So in those circumstances, we have to tell parents that what we're focused on is the autonomy of teachers and having the highest quality of teachers and making sure that they deliver for children.
Okay, so you think the teachers should be accountable. But
Absolutely.
In our country, it's now being promoted the idea of performance pay. Mm-hmm. Do you have performance pay in Scotland?
No, and I think, to be fair, from the discussion I've heard in New Zealand, this is actually about having different ways in which people can fulfil the role of teacher. Now, that is a live and good discussion. One of the problems in teaching is that those who want to get on in teaching leave the classroom, so the best teachers don't stay in the classroom. We've worked on that. We had a chartered teachers scheme, which I don't think worked as well as we wanted to have. Now, we don't have performance pay, but we do have accountability. And another discussion, I think, that there's a great similarity between New Zealand and Scotland in a discussion on registration and professional standards. We have a fully independent registrar, the General Teaching Council for Scotland. Every teacher has to be registered with that body. There is no dubiety about that. Now, the opposite system exists south of the border. That body has been abolished. There's no possibility of it being abolished in Scotland. And I think moves in New Zealand to have a registration system which is strong, which is self-regulated, which supports teachers, is a good one.
But unfortunately, what we're also seeing with the introduction of charter schools is the possibility of unqualified people in classrooms. Would you ever tolerate that in Scotland?
We don't do that. There is a small anomaly in the law in terms of some independent schools can appoint unqualified teachers. It's not something I'm particularly happy with, and it's something that we're considering very seriously. But the vast majority, overwhelming majority, 99.9% of teachers teaching in Scottish schools and everybody in the state sector has to be registered. Indeed, we do get complaints from people who come from England or Wales who aren't fully qualified to our standards but have held senior positions in education in England and who find it rather difficult to understand. And I'm usually the villain of the piece, particularly when I have to say to them, we have an independent registration process. I can't influence it in the slightest.
Is education a commodity or a right?
Well, it is possible to be both, but I wouldn't describe it in either of those ways. I would say education is... In our sense, education is one of the founding principles of the country, and therefore it is something that everybody should have access to. Is it a right? Yes, it is a right, but it is something more than a right. It is something without which you cannot expect to be a full citizen. You cannot expect to have a country that is fully equitable and democratic. It just underpins who we are.
After the great exodus of Scots from Scotland in the 50s and the 60s, it seemed to me when I went back that there was a country that was having to try and rebuild itself. Has that rebuilding happened, and what's the role of education been in that?
Well, I think Scotland's a country that constantly reinvents itself, re-engages with the world. I'm very struck when I travel the world, and I used to be External Affairs Minister as well. When you travel the world and you meet Scots and people who are descendants of Scots, they didn't just come because things were bad in Scotland. You know, it wasn't born entirely out of misery. It was also born out of an engagement, a view that they wanted to live in a place that they created. I think Dunedin's a great example of that, where people came from difficult social circumstances, but they also came with a vision of what they wanted to happen. Now, I think Scotland as a nation is doing that again, and the referendum process we're going through at the moment is that re-engagement with the modern world and recreating ourselves. And it's a very invigorating process, I have to say. I don't think political life in Scotland has ever been like this. You have village hall meetings in my constituency with 50 or 60 people discussing this, when everybody thought, politics was dead. But education is a very important part of that. Education is partly, well, almost entirely devolved to the Scottish Parliament, but there are issues, financial issues, about how you work in education, which we can only resolve with full fiscal powers.
What's the purpose of an education?
It's a very interesting point. It's not deterministic. I'm going to start with what it isn't, which is what I don't normally do. It's not deterministic. It's not about just being able to earn a living. It is, in that phrase, usually attributed to Newton, but might be by somebody else, it is the lighting of a fire. I usually see it as a way in which individuals become full citizens and contribute as full citizens. But it is, without it, there isn't citizenship, there isn't engagement, there isn't purpose, and we need to make sure that every individual, their potential is fully realised.
You see, that used to be exactly what we thought education was about in New Zealand, and a man called Clarence Beebe stated almost exactly what you said in the 1950s. Now, we reinvented our system of education under a business model, and it seems to me that education in our country has shrunken its vision of what education should be.
I don't think you should confuse means with ends. I think that the education ministers I meet worldwide are all motivated by a passion for learning and for young people, particularly young people, and for their progress. I don't dispute their motivation for a moment. There is an active and I think healthy debate in most countries about how that is done. Yeah. And I think in some places that is done on a very deterministic and monetaristic way, a way in which sees competition as the only way forward. I think that what is happening in England probably is one of the extreme examples of it. And there are other ways, and one of the other ways I think Scotland is particularly addicted to is that open community view, and that comes very strongly from our history. We have a system that is accountable to the local community.
I'll talk again about the New Zealand situation. I see that, I was a former teacher for 12 years, but I left before tomorrow's schools and all the revolutions. I'm going back and trying to figure out what went on here. And what I see is testing, like PISA testing. There was a great furor in our country when we found that we'd apparently slipped from the top 10 down. And then we're seeing NCA and national standards being used as a weapon rather than a tool. Testing used to be a tool. Now it seems to have become a weapon to bash teachers with.
It is perverse in any country to see an education system, an examination system, as being the success of which is judged by the number of people who fail. And that does happen. What we see assessment is, and I'd rather call it assessment rather than examination systems, assessment is about ensuring that progress is made, but you shouldn't do in the classic phrase about consultants, who borrow your watch to tell you the time and then sell it back to you. You shouldn't take that watch to pieces all the time. And the solution to that is trusting the workforce. If you look at really great education systems throughout the world, Finns were an example, but there are others, particularly in European terms, then those systems are based on two things. They're based on a continuity of education policy. The wrong thing in education is to have half a dozen ideas before breakfast. That doesn't work. The second thing they're based on is high quality teaching. We are just in the process of introducing a master's level profession. We continue to drive the educational standards of the profession up, but that not only implies it demands teacher autonomy. You trust teachers to do things, and one of the discussions that education ministers have regularly is how you get that autonomy without interfering in it. There is a tendency within any system, and particularly within the civil servants, towards bureaucracy, towards complexity. And what we should be constantly looking for is to have this a simple system that says we trust teachers to teach. That's what we employ them for. As long as we train them well, we know we've got them right, then they go into the classroom and they teach. And what we then negotiate is the outcomes. We look at those outcomes. But if we have too much bureaucracy, too much complexity, too much workload, too much checking, constant checking, then we don't do the system a service and we don't do kids a service.
What about assisting teachers once they're in the classroom to be constantly on their game? Do you give them time out to study?
They have to have continuous professional development. There has to be a system of career renewal or refresh. We have that within our GTC system, but that is part of the professionalism of any profession. Nobody in a profession says, well, that's me trained, I won't bother to look at another book or do anything else for the next 40 years, particularly in the world we live in. That is the responsibility of teachers, and they take it seriously. But if we constantly harp on about failing teachers, and that's one of the things that some systems do, then we forget that, there are failing politicians, there are failing filmmakers, there are failing journalists. In every profession you have issues and problems, you need regulation and structure to get rid of them. But in teaching, it is that enthusiasm, that determination to succeed, that excitement for ideas and for young people that should take us forward.